So this case study is a mix of everything. There's many parts to it, and we tackled each problem one at a time. So for the case description, just to give an idea, this was a preschooler, age 4, no specific diagnosis. It was a child that enjoyed bed hopping throughout the night, fell asleep watching the iPad in one person's bed, and then in the middle of the night would find another bed to crawl into. When the child did fall asleep after the initial fall asleep, they would be placed in their own bed and again start to seek out other places to sleep, whichever bed was available. Now, in this case, there were some medical considerations that needed to be addressed as well as aware of and just get some support. One was the snoring. There was occasional snoring and or noises being made and mouth open while breathing. So we suggested getting medical support there just to rule out any sleep apnea as it did run in the family. Problems were night wakings, early wakings, you name it. So we'll dive into that now. Parent goals for this case were, the top priority was to teach the child to fall asleep on their own at that initial fall asleep, staying in their own bed, as well as developing some healthy sleep habits. This was difficult to do in the past. They had tried other strategies and nothing worked yet. The next step was to reduce night wakings and teach consolidated sleep. Last, the child was not sleeping long enough for their age. So our goal was to increase the overall duration of sleep through extending those early wakings and figuring out what was happening to want to wake up. Again, what reinforcement were they needing? Part 1 was removing the sleep dependency. Oh, I bolded the wrong one, but that's okay. There were 2 options available to fade the parent out of the room. First option was time-based visiting, which Hillary just did a great job of explaining that, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on the procedure. In this case, they decided to go with this one. We started at taking 1 to 2 steps away from the bed and then coming back and slowly built up from that. To explain the second option, just to provide a different idea of how you can fade from the bedroom, we offered distance fading as an idea. This is when you systematically fade the distance from being in the bed to being outside of the room each night and slowly further and further away to eventually you can just close the door and leave. This procedure can take much longer. And it can be difficult to fade depending on the child's comfort level of the parent being out of sight. That's usually where we start to see anxiety peak up and it can be quite difficult. Anyway, they chose with the time-based visiting. And if there's questions about the distance fading, please feel free to drop that in the chat. Here's a graph of what the visits looked like. So the first night we started with an adjusted bedtime 30 minutes later than average. They fell asleep within 6 visits on the first night, 9 visits on the second one. And by the end, so by the 8th night, the parent was only doing 1 check-in at around 30 minutes. So it faded really nicely the first time. Once they were confident in falling asleep alone, we did a second round of time-based visiting because we had found out that there was a light that had been left on in the room and there was some anxiety around sleeping in the dark. And this could be attributing to the night wakings, so we wanted to see if we could fade that out. When medical was ruled out, we then tackled falling asleep with the light off, so making sure the night wakings weren't being caused by a medical concern. The child expressed some fear around concern. However, she would fall asleep. She would wake up and walk around all of the upstairs in the pitch black in the middle of the night. So mom really did want to try and work on this with them. And again, going at their own pace. So with it being dark, there were more visits the first night. She did extremely well. So that's that. On the graph, you'll see the first red line. So between the first and second red line, that's our second fading out the parent with the light. And it's almost double the amount of visits. Okay. Now addressing the night wakings. So after fading out the light, the night wakings still persisted. And it continued to even happen after that. So once the light was resolved, we then worked to support the child in falling back to sleep during those times awake at night. This can be tricky. The parent tried to do time-based visiting in the middle of the night, but it began to become too exhausting to keep getting up each night, and night waking still did not really decrease. At least one, and sometimes would sneak in the bed and be able to find that sweet spot where parents can't feel you and would end up needing reinforcement. So to support motivation in staying in their own bed, we chose to move from our option 1, continuing with time-based visiting, to introducing something called the bedtime pass. And this is heavily researched. For some reason, it works really well with some kids, not all kids, but some. And in this case, the student was given 3 bedtime passes to use at night. This pass had their name on it. I think it was all colored and stickers. It was very special. They worked on it together and parents explained it to them. So each morning, if they still had a pass, they could exchange the pass for a jewel, which then, adding up the jewels, they could then exchange for a special prize. And this prize was something that the student really, really wanted. We chose to do 3 bedtime passes as they were likely to wake up 1 to 2 times each night. 3 passes would ensure they were successful the first night. When the pass would be exchanged, this would be an option for tuck-in, glass of water, bathroom trip with mom. Once introduction of the pass was in place, night waking started to decrease. The motivations to stay in bed and keep the passes was stronger than wanting to leave the bed and find the adult. There was one burst of night wakings, which we'll see in the graph. Let's see if I can go. Here we go, yeah. There was one burst of night wakings after we started to fade the light, and that started to peak down. The child had met reinforcement, had gone in the parent's bed. Again, exhaustion kicks in and sometimes that happens, but then it started to settle into less night wakings over time. Lastly, we looked at addressing early wakings. As well as night wakings, this kind of can work using something that we call stimulus control, but really trying to show the child when it's time to be awake and it's time to be asleep. In this case, we use the Hippo clock, which I find very cute, and it comes in many different colors. Not an advertisement for them at all. But this use of the clock, or there's a Grow clock that also works, can be helpful for kids who like predictability and like that structure. In this case, it was helpful to show the child and refer back to the clock in the middle of the night to explain, oh, the clock is, I think it's either off or it's really dark, or if it's blue. And that means it's not time to be awake yet. The colors do need to be taught. So when it's time to be awake, I think you can set it really to whichever color you want. Green might be awake, blue might be sleeping. And the parent would calmly bring the child back to bed and remind them it's not awake time yet. On the other hand, I've worked with kids who have these, and these clocks can actually cause more anxiety and signal impending doom if they start to turn the color of sleep, or if it's signaling like it's time to be asleep and they're not asleep. So really being mindful of, is this a good fit? And it does have to be taught. It's not a magical quick fix. Some kids get it though, right away. So overall, the duration of sleep increased and maintained during follow-up. Early mornings started to become more reasonable and bedtime was seamless. If early mornings did happen, again, reminders of the clock were brought back to the clock, reminding it's not time to be awake yet, as well as breakfast didn't start and the morning routine didn't start. Lesson learned from this case, the assessment process is so important, asking and answering all of those questions, those detailed questions, and open communication between all involved is important. We missed the light, that's okay. We bounced back, which was good. And this is a case where we piecemealed the plan together a little bit, which took longer, but in the end, the goals were reached and the child was rested and getting more sleep. So in this graph, you can see the overall sleep duration started to increase, which is what we wanted.
This is a topic that we often get a lot of questions on. And it's usually a conversation that it's a tricky conversation to have with families starting out. And it's one that, again, like I've talked about, we really need to make sure we're including medical professionals and understanding the why behind some of the medication suggestions. It's not uncommon, again, within a medical model to want to fix the problem. And medication is usually the quickest and easiest way to do that. However, there's obviously some risks to prescribing medication for sleep. So one of the first things we want to know is, why was this medication suggested? Is there a reason for it other than its side effect is sleep? So clonidine typically is for blood pressure. There's another medication, I can't remember the name of it, that we see quite commonly as well, which is actually a seizure medication. So often when medication is recommended, it tends not to be a sleep medication per se, but rather the side effect is sleep or drowsiness. And there really hasn't been a lot of research in this area in terms of these medications being used for their side effects as opposed for their intended purposes, and particularly for the kids that we've served and worked with. So whether it is autistic or ADHD or another medical underlying concern, there really is no research telling us whether these medications are a good idea, what the long-term side impacts would be, et cetera. So we always want to ask why. And we've definitely worked with families where there is a reason why the medication is in place other than sleep. And then we keep the medication, obviously, and we work around it. We figure out, okay, so if it is sleep pressure, how can we extend it? How can we increase the sleep pressure? Are there any other side effects that may be going on with the medication that could be impacting them? Sometimes medications have side effects like kind of an upset tummy, changes in appetite. So particularly if we see grazing or we see kind of ups and downs in appetite, wondering whether the medication has anything to do with that, because we do know that the circadian rhythm really needs that anchor and passage of time. So having those regular set meals is important. So taking a look at why and understanding and having that conversation with the medical professional is really important. It's important that we're always considering, when we're using medication, what the underlying issue could be. So medication, because its effect essentially is sedation, can mask any other sleep problems that are going on. So it could be when you remove or start to fade out medication, you see all sorts of other things pop up. Maybe you see that the child actually isn't tired at that time. It's not their typical bedtime, and that was the problem in the beginning. Or maybe other things are popping up that you need to address. So it kind of masks what the real sleep problem is. So if we are able to fade medication, we definitely recommend it. One, just because of the side effects, but also you can't really tackle sleep without understanding the why. The concern with medication as well would be if we stay on medication and let's say we tackle night waking or we tackle something that's going on at bedtime, when that medication is actually faded, the sleep problem it was masking could pop right up, in which case now we have to go back and start again. So it's often recommended that we fade the medication first, tackle the sleep problem, whatever it looks like. We've definitely had cases where we have faded it very slowly and then started to implement some changes with the sleep routine or some changes in the day. And so we kind of piecemeal and do it very, very slowly because there's concerns perhaps the child's been on the medication for a while. Perhaps the medication is also helping with other worrisome behaviors occurring during the day. So it's not uncommon for medication to be given for things like aggressive behavior or perhaps anxiety, et cetera. So if it is going to be faded, we want to make sure we're monitoring all the other concerns that there may be so we can jump in right away and problem solve if we need to. This is also usually where we're working very closely with the teen. So if a family is already working with a consultant, we want to make sure we're working with them really closely to understand what could happen, what's been seen in the past, what's the current plan in place, how can we support that at bedtime, how can we kind of work with everybody to come up with a good plan, not only for fading the medication, but for dealing with what may happen when that medication is faded. The other piece to understand when it comes to medication, and we talked a little bit about this in relation to alcohol, is medicated sleep is sedated sleep. So you don't actually go through all of the cycles of sleep when you're on medication. It can vary, but typically you don't hit that deep sleep, that deep restorative sleep that you need, and you may not spend enough time in REM sleep. So while the medication is helping you sleep, quote unquote, you're not actually, your quality of sleep is impaired. So you're sleeping, but you may not be rested. It may not have the restorative effect. That's an important piece to think about as well, is kind of the pros and cons of the medication. We're sleeping, but are we really, and are we seeing the benefits of sleep? The other area we get a lot of questions on as well is melatonin, which is a tricky one. So melatonin is over the counter, so you can usually get it by going into a pharmacy. It is not regulated, so the ingredients can vary depending on brand and within brand. And there really isn't a lot of research supporting its effectiveness long-term, and there really isn't enough supporting research, particularly for autistic individuals, which is where it's most commonly used, because typically the assumption is, well, if autism is involved, that means that you won't sleep, and that's not the case. But often melatonin would be the first thing that's given. Also remembering what melatonin does. It's a timing thing. It doesn't help you sustain sleep, and it doesn't actually help you initiate sleep. It just is that starter pistol in the race of sleep that says, okay, let's go. And then all other systems need to be ready to kick in order for that to work. If all else is a mess and nothing else is in place, if you try to give melatonin outside in the backyard while a child's jumping on a trampoline and there's full sun in their face, it's not going to do its job, and you're going to think it's not working. But really, it probably is. There's just a lot else competing with it. It's kind of dampening its effects. So it's important when you do give melatonin that you're timing it 20 to 30 minutes before bed, that all other sleep conditions are in place. So you've dimmed the lights, you're getting into a set routine, you're able to get into bed, into a calming place where your body's ready for sleep, and then it's more likely to work. What we have seen, and I've seen it, there's not a ton of research behind it, but what I have seen, and I've read it in a couple different places, is melatonin sometimes can actually worsen night wakings, and this is indirectly. If you recall that the steep rise in melatonin and then dip in melatonin is needed in order to sustain sleep, it's that hormone that kind of maintains your night, right? So yes, it's still dark, it's still sleep time, still sleep time, still sleep time. Now it's not, and then your wake drive kicks in. Your body naturally produces melatonin. So if your body's naturally producing it and you're at the levels that you need to be, adding more melatonin could trick your system into thinking, great, it's there, we don't need to produce any. In which case, if your timing is off in delivery, your peak won't be where it needs to be, and your wake drive could kick in sooner than you need it to. So sometimes melatonin can actually offset your natural development. It's also important to note that your natural development of melatonin is actually a really small amount. I think it's less than 1 milligram. And yet sometimes kids are prescribed 5 to 10 milligrams of melatonin, which is a lot. So keeping in mind that if you're going to add melatonin into your system, you want it to be at par with what your body would naturally produce. We don't want to overdo it and add too much, because again, it's not going to sustain sleep. It can also sometimes have a drowsy effect, which goes back to sleep dependencies. So whether it be medication or melatonin, if I'm used to going to sleep really drowsy, like that sedated feeling, and I wake at night and I don't have that drowsy feeling anymore, I may not be able to get back to sleep. So sometimes it can also become a sleep dependency, where I need that drowsy feeling to fall asleep. If it's not there, my sleep system doesn't kick in, my body doesn't know it's time to sleep. And so I'm up. So that's another thing to think about when we're talking about melatonin. It is commonly prescribed. I really encourage parents to always talk with pharmacists as well. Typically, pharmacists know more about medication, side effects, half-life, et cetera, than medical professionals do, because that's their job. So talking with a pharmacist about a specific brand, is this a good brand? Is this a brand that's pretty consistent in its production? Is it well reputable? Because they can shift depending on brand and within brand just because they aren't regulated. So it's always a good idea to talk with your medical professional and talk with the pharmacist about it as well.
Okay. Now, we're kind of diving into, let me look at the time here. Okay, good. We have a couple more slides, just really basic takeaways. Learning about healthy sleep, and I think we've done a lot of talking around this today, but just some main things that you can do to adjust the clock and adjust healthy sleep. So again, we've talked about how our clock is a 24-hour schedule. Light keeps it in check. We're more likely, so we know about this now, and our bodies are going to be on this rhythm. So really understanding individual rhythms and seeing how you can monitor that and how you can keep it the same every day is going to be helpful. Again, light. Light signals our body when to be awake and when to be asleep. There is something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it's right between our eyes. And this light is detected through our retinas, and it tells us when it's time to go to sleep and when it's not. So using light to your advantage. There's some great research done by, again, that author that I mentioned, Linda Geddes. She wrote a book called Chasing the Sun, and the information that she found from the Amish community is so helpful in just knowing that the light, we're naturally inclined to live by the daylight, so using that to help anchor sleep is going to be key. Eating routines, that's something you can set up today or tomorrow, and just making sure that everything is on a really consistent schedule of the clock. And then lastly, physical activity. Keeping movement going. It doesn't have to be super intense, but also just knowing what are the averages needed for the age of that student or the age of the learner and embedding that within the day. Best results from the research says physical activity in the morning. Again, when our cortisol is highest, we're more likely to be able to move and keep going. In the evenings, our cortisol goes down, so our alertness is a little bit lower, but for best results when it comes to healthy sleep, embedding it in the morning is good. Sometimes pairing it with a walk, so you could pair it with light exposure and a walk. That also gets to right there. And that's kind of our summary on that one. These are the top 3 changes to make, and we reviewed that in the previous slide too. And if there are any questions, I don't know if there's any. There's none so far in the chat, but if you have any, drop them in. But I think we are done, so thank you so much.